A 6-year-old girl vanished from a crowded Colorado playground in broad daylight without a single person seeing what happened. Before we dive in, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And if you're into unsolved mysteries, disappearances, and cold cases that still haunt investigators, make sure you hit subscribe. Tomorrow, we're uncovering another case that will leave you questioning everything. It began on a warm spring afternoon in 1994 in a neighborhood that looked like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. Rows of quiet houses rested against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, the kind of place where morning sunlight spilled gently across porches and the distant sound of birds mixed with the rustling of tall pine trees. People walked their dogs, children rode their bicycles freely, and neighbors waved to one another without a second thought. It was peaceful, predictable, safe. On this particular day, there was no warning that anything would disrupt that peace. No sense of unease settling over the town. No strange vehicles lurking on corners. No suspicious figures shadowing children. Just the ordinary rhythm of a typical Saturday afternoon. Ava Merrick was 6 years old, small for her age, shy but observant, with big brown eyes that seemed too reflective for someone so young. She wore her favorite yellow shirt that day, the one with tiny embroidered flowers along the sleeves. Her mother had brushed her hair into a loose ponytail, soft strands falling out to frame her face. On her back was the pink heart-shaped backpack she carried everywhere, even when it held nothing more than a crumpled drawing and a tiny plastic bracelet. Inside the Merrick household, the day had started normally. Breakfast dishes still sat in the sink. A half-finished coloring page lay on the dining table, and sunlight streamed across the living room carpet. Ava had spent the morning playing with her stuffed rabbit, its once white fur worn down from years of being hugged, and quietly humming to herself as she moved from room to room. Her parents, Mark and Lillian, had no reason to believe anything out of the ordinary would happen. Ava had asked if she and her older brother, Jacob, could go to the playground after lunch, something she requested almost every weekend. It was their routine, their ritual, a chance for Jacob to run wild with the other boys and for Ava to sit on the swing and feel the wind brush against her face. And so, just as they had done dozens of times before, the Merrick parents agreed. The siblings walked down the sidewalk together, Jacob slightly ahead, Ava trailing behind with quick little steps to keep up. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and warm asphalt. The sky was the color of a washed-out watercolor painting, lightly streaked with thin clouds that drifted lazily across the horizon. When they arrived at the playground, it was alive with movement. Children yelled to one another from the top of the climbing tower. A father tossed a frisbee to his golden retriever in the open field. A group of mothers sat on a bench near the slide, sipping iced tea from plastic cups and talking about everything from school events to the best local mechanic. Birds chirped from the trees that bordered the park, adding a natural soundtrack to the laughter and chatter. It was the kind of environment where parents let their guard down, not because they were careless, but because danger simply didn't exist in their minds. Not here, not in this town. Ava went straight to the swings. She always did. The swings were her sanctuary, her favorite place in the world. She'd hold the metal chains tightly, pump her legs, and let her hair blow behind her as she leaned back and closed her eyes, pretending she could fly. Jacob ran ahead to join his friends in a game of tag, kicking up dust as his sneakers hit the dirt. For a while, everything was perfectly normal, perfectly safe. Parents watched their children lazily, confident they had time to talk, to relax, to enjoy the warm afternoon without hovering. The playground was open, visible, predictable. Nothing seemed out of place. No tension hung in the air. No shadow lingered where it didn't belong. And then, somewhere between 4:10 and 4:15 p.m., the impossible happened. One moment, Ava was on the swing. A woman pushing a stroller later recalled seeing her there, gently rocking back and forth, her small feet slowing her momentum. A group of teens biking past saw her too, a little girl in yellow, her backpack slipping off one shoulder. But then, in a window of time so short it barely made sense, she was gone. Not wandering, not running, not crying. Gone. When Jacob turned around to check on her, he expected to see his sister exactly where he'd left her, sitting quietly, swinging gently, watching him play. But the swing was empty, turning slightly in the breeze. No sign of her anywhere. At first he thought she might be hiding. Maybe she wanted him to chase her. Maybe she went to look at the flowers by the fence. Maybe she'd walk toward the sandbox. Children do that. They move. They explore. But as he circled the playground, calling her name, each place where he expected to find her instead greeted him with nothing but silence. He checked behind the slide, behind the climbing tower, behind the bathrooms, behind the picnic tables. Nothing. His voice grew more frantic. "Ava!" His tone shifted from playful to confused, to scared. The sound of his rising panic was the first crack in the illusion of safety that had coated the playground moments before. He sprinted to his mother, breathless, heart pounding, insisting he couldn't find her. Lillian's first instinct was to reassure him. Kids wander, kids hide, kids get distracted. But when she scanned the playground and didn't see a flash of yellow anywhere, no ponytail, no backpack, no small figure waiting to be found, her stomach dropped. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. She called Ava's name, her voice sharp and trembling. Other parents paused. Their conversations faded. Movement slowed as the realization crept across the park. A child was missing. What started as a few parents searching quickly turned into a crowd combing every space in sight. Behind bushes, under slides, around tree trunks. A mother abandoned her stroller to help. Teenagers got off their bikes and ran in every direction. A father jogged across the field calling Ava's name. Even people driving past stopped their cars to join the search. But no matter where they looked, Ava wasn't there. The playground transformed from a place of laughter and sunlight into a scene of fear and disbelief. The swing swayed quietly. The slide gleamed under the afternoon sun. The climbing tower cast long shadows across the sand. Everything looked the same, except the little girl who should have been there was nowhere to be found. And as the minutes stretched into hours, a chilling truth settled over everyone present. A child could not simply disappear like that. Not here, not in the open, not without someone noticing. Unless someone planned it, unless someone was watching, unless someone had waited for the perfect moment. A moment of distraction, a moment of noise, a moment when every pair of eyes blinked at the same time. And in that fragile, unguarded second, they took her. It was the moment the town changed forever. The moment innocence cracked. The moment Ava's story became a mystery that would haunt Colorado for decades. And it was only the beginning. Ava Merrick was the kind of child people remembered, though not because she was loud or outgoing. In fact, it was the opposite. She had a quiet presence, the kind that made adults smile without even realizing it. There was something gentle about the way she moved, the way she observed the world, the way she held her stuffed rabbit by the arm as she walked from room to room. She was tender, thoughtful, and endlessly curious. Her mother used to say that Ava could spend hours just studying tiny things, ladybugs crawling across windowsills, the glimmer of light reflecting off a puddle, the way leaves twirled as they fell from the trees. She wasn't a child who rushed from place to place. She took her time, soaking in the world like every detail mattered, and for her, it did. The Merrick home reflected that softness. Their living room was filled with warm colors, a slightly worn sofa, shelves covered in framed photos, and the faint smell of lavender from the candle Lillian kept lit near the kitchen. Drawings were taped to the refrigerator, stick figures, flowers, a house with a roof too big for its walls, and a smiling sun in the corner. Ava loved coloring. She didn't always stay inside the lines, but her pictures had a brightness to them that felt unmistakably hers. Her parents, Mark and Lillian, were hardworking, middle class, and devoted to their children. Mark worked long hours as an electrician, but every night he was home in time to read Ava a story before bed. Lillian worked part-time at a local bakery and spent the rest of her days shuttling between school drop-offs, grocery shopping, and managing the organized chaos of family life. They adored their daughter. Everyone could see that. And then there was Jacob, Ava's older brother. At 8 years old, he was energetic and bold, the opposite of Ava in many ways. He climbed the tallest trees, rode his bike without fear, and collected bruises the way some kids collected stickers. But despite his wild spirit, he was fiercely protective of his little sister. If she was scared, he held her hand. If she fell, he picked her up. If anyone upset her, Jacob was the first one to step in. Their bond was simple and pure. She followed him everywhere, and he never pushed her away. On the morning of her disappearance, the two of them had eaten pancakes at the kitchen table. Ava insisted on adding too many chocolate chips, and Jacob teased her for the way she stacked the pancakes into what she called her tower. Their father smiled as he listened to them, sipping his coffee, unaware it would be one of the last ordinary mornings they would ever share. After breakfast, Ava wandered into her room to gather a few of her treasures. She placed her stuffed rabbit in her backpack, added a tiny bracelet she had made out of plastic beads, then zipped it with careful precision. She liked having little pieces of home with her wherever she went. It made her feel safe. Jacob waited impatiently by the door, bouncing on the balls of his feet, eager to get to the playground. Ava slipped her backpack over her shoulders. It was almost as big as she was, and the two siblings stepped outside. The sun was warm on their faces. The sidewalk smelled faintly of pine. A gentle breeze brushed against Ava's ponytail, lifting the loose strands away from her cheeks. As they walked, Ava skipped occasionally, humming a tune she'd probably heard earlier that morning. She stopped once to pick up a small rock she found interesting and tucked it into the front pocket of her backpack. Jacob rolled his eyes, but he waited for her. He always did. Neighbors who saw them pass by later described the same scene. Two children walking to the playground. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Just another day. Just another walk. Just another afternoon in a town where the worst thing people worried about was whether their sprinklers were working. And that's what makes Ava's disappearance so chilling. There were no warning signs, no suspicious cars trailing them, no strange figures lingering nearby, nothing that would make anyone pause or hold their child closer. The Merrick family didn't live on the edge of danger. They lived in a place built on routine, normalcy, and trust. Ava didn't wander the world recklessly. She wasn't the type to run off or test boundaries or disappear behind trees without saying a word. She stayed close. She stayed predictable. She stayed safe. Everything about her life suggested stability, and that stability makes what happened next all the more unexplainable, because Ava didn't have a complicated home life. She didn't have enemies. She wasn't neglected. She wasn't a runaway risk. She was a child who loved butterflies and coloring books, a child who still held her mother's hand when crossing the street, a child who believed the world was kind and gentle. That innocence should have protected her, but innocence means nothing to the kind of person who was lurking that day. Someone who understood how to exploit trust. Someone who saw a quiet child as an opportunity. Someone who stopped seeing her as a little girl and instead saw her as a target. Looking back, detectives tried desperately to pinpoint anything at all, that suggested Ava's life held clues to what happened. A pattern, a person, a hidden detail waiting to be uncovered. But there wasn't one. Everything about Ava's world was normal. Everything about her day was ordinary. Everything about her routine matched countless afternoons before it, and maybe that is what made the person who took her feel so confident, because when nothing seems out of place, no one is watching for danger. And when no one is watching, that's when the unimaginable can happen. When Ava and Jacob reached the playground that afternoon, the sun was still high in the sky, casting long, soft shadows across the open field. The entire park buzzed with movement, children racing up the wooden climbing structure, parents chatting casually on benches, dogs tugging on their leashes, chasing distant scents. The air smelled like sunscreen, warm dust, and budding pine trees. It was the kind of afternoon that made people forget the world could ever be dangerous. Ava stopped near the entrance of the playground and looked around slowly, taking in the scene the way she always did, quietly, carefully, as if she wanted to memorize it. Jacob didn't wait. He darted forward the second he spotted his friends. They yelled his name, and he waved back, his feet kicking up bits of gravel as he ran. Ava smiled a little at his excitement, then wandered toward the row of swings. The swings stood slightly apart from the rest of the equipment, positioned on a bed of soft wood chips. The chains gleamed in the sunlight, and when the wind moved through them, they clinked gently like tiny bells. It was the only place in the entire playground where Ava felt completely at ease. She didn't like climbing too high or sliding too fast, but the rhythm of swinging, back and forth, up and down, smooth and steady, calmed her. She climbed into one of the seats, gripping the cool metal chains with both hands. She kicked gently against the ground, starting with small movements and then gradually building into a slow, floating sway. Her ponytail lifted with every backward motion, then settled against her shoulders when she swung forward. Her yellow shirt glowed in the sunlight. Several people later told investigators they saw her there. A woman pushing a stroller passed by around 4:10 p.m. and remembered seeing a little girl with a pink backpack. A teenage couple biking across the path recalled a child on the swing, her legs dangling as she rocked back and forth. A jogger saw her too, though only for a moment, just a blur of yellow and brown hair framed against the backdrop of pines. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing grabbed anyone's attention. Ava was just another child on a warm spring afternoon. Meanwhile, across the playground, Jacob was fully immersed in a game of tag. He ran in wild zigzags, dodging other children, laughing loudly as he narrowly escaped being caught. His sneakers pounded across the ground, leaving little puffs of dust behind him. He looked over at Ava occasionally, just to check, just to be sure she was still there. And every time he looked, she was exactly where he expected her to be. At 4:12 p.m., she was sitting upright on the swing, her feet brushing against the dirt. At 4:13 p.m., she was still there, rocking gently. At 4:14 p.m., Jacob glanced back again. She was gone. No sound, no scream, no struggle, just empty air. The swing she had been sitting on was still in motion, swaying lightly as if she'd only just hopped off. The chain rattled faintly, the seat tilting slightly, but Ava was nowhere in sight. At first, Jacob didn't panic. Kids get distracted. Kids move. Kids switch activities without announcing it. He assumed she had wandered over to the slide or the sandbox. Maybe she went to look at the flowers near the fence. Maybe she needed a break from swinging. Maybe, just maybe, she wanted to play with him instead. He scanned the playground quickly, expecting to spot a flash of yellow, but no matter where he looked, she wasn't there. He jogged toward the slide, calling her name. No answer. He ran to the sandbox, eyes darting across every little face. Nothing. He checked behind the climbing tower. Empty. He circled the bathrooms. Quiet. His calls grew louder, thinner, tinged with fear. Ava! Ava! The sounds of laughter around him continued for a moment longer, unaware, untouched. But slowly, a few children turned their heads. A few parents paused mid-sentence. Something in his voice pierced the calm. Jacob ran back to the swing set, hoping, desperately, that she had returned there while he'd been searching. But the swing still hung empty, still drifting gently, still marking the exact spot where she had last been seen. The realization hit him in a sudden wave of dread. Ava wasn't hiding. She wasn't playing. She wasn't anywhere. Jacob's breathing became sharp, uneven. His eyes darted everywhere, left, right, toward the trees, toward the field, toward the parking lot. He tried to tell himself he was overreacting. Maybe she had found someone she knew. Maybe their mom had come early. Maybe she was nearby and he just couldn't see her. But deep down, something in his chest tightened, something cold and heavy. He broke into a sprint toward their mother, who was sitting on a bench not far from the playground's entrance. He practically collided into her, grabbing her arm, shaking her with frantic urgency he'd never felt before. "I can't find Ava," he gasped. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. At first, Lillian didn't understand. She blinked, confused, then glanced toward the swings. Her eyes scanned the area where her daughter should have been, where she had always been, and a sharp bolt of fear cut through her body when she saw nothing. She stood abruptly, her heart thundering against her ribs. "What do you mean you can't find her?" Her voice trembled, even though she tried her best to keep it steady. Jacob pointed wildly toward the playground. "She was just there. She was swinging, and then she wasn't." Lillian didn't wait. She rushed across the playground, calling Ava's name with a voice that grew more desperate with each passing second. Other parents looked up. Conversations halted. Heads turned. The air changed, tightening like a rope pulled too hard. Within moments, people were on their feet, scanning the area, instinctively searching for a small girl in yellow. The playground suddenly felt too big, too open, with too many places she should have been, and none where she was. A few parents checked the bathrooms. Others jogged the perimeter of the field. One mother knelt to look under the picnic tables. Another pushed aside branches near the tree line. Someone checked the parking lot, walking between cars, bending down to look underneath each one. But step by step, minute by minute, the truth became impossible to deny. A little girl had vanished, in broad daylight, surrounded by people, and no one had seen how. The impossible had happened, and the nightmare was only beginning. The moment the first wave of panic rippled through the playground, everything changed. The atmosphere shifted sharply, as though the warmth of the day had been sucked out of the air. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Children stopped playing. A heavy, eerie stillness settled over the park, even though dozens of people still stood there. One by one, parents turned toward the Merrick family. Some didn't know exactly what was happening yet, but the look on Lillian's face said enough. Her eyes were wide, frantic, scanning every direction at once. Her breath shook each time she shouted her daughter's name. Others quickly joined in the search. People who had never spoken to the Merrick family before were suddenly sprinting across the park, calling out, lifting up benches, moving trash cans, checking behind trees. It didn't matter that they didn't know Ava personally. There was a universal fear that spread like wildfire through the community. When a child goes missing, every parent feels it. The first 10 minutes were chaos. A group of teenagers combed the climbing structure, checking every platform, peeking down the slide. A father jogged toward the open field, waving his arms in wide motions, scanning the horizon for a small figure in yellow. A woman with a stroller walked the entire length of the parking lot, stopping to look under every vehicle even though she feared what she might find. But they didn't find anything. No backpack, no shoe, no trail of footprints, nothing. A man who lived nearby sprinted home to grab a flashlight, even though the sun was still up, because he said it was better to be prepared for anything. Another woman ran door to door along the houses facing the playground, knocking desperately, asking if anyone had seen a little girl. People were sweating, panting, trembling. Some were crying, even though they didn't know Ava. Others tried to comfort the Merrick family, placing hands on their shoulders with a kind of helpless tenderness. And then, at 4:30 p.m., someone finally said the words that everyone else had been avoiding. "Call the police." The 911 call was rushed, panicked, nearly incoherent. The operator had to repeat questions several times just to get basic details. But one thing stood out in the caller's voice, a desperation that made even seasoned dispatchers sit up straighter. Units were sent immediately. In small towns, police respond fast. But this time, it felt like they were moving through molasses. Every second stretched into an eternity. Every minute felt like it lasted too long. Parents kept searching, voices cracking as they shouted Ava's name, begging for her to answer. No one was ready to accept what was becoming clearer with each passing moment. This wasn't an ordinary lost child scenario. When the first patrol car arrived, officers stepped out with a kind of urgency that didn't need explanation. They asked quick questions. Where was she last seen? Who was watching? What was she wearing? But even as they gathered information, their eyes were sweeping the park, searching for clues. One officer radioed for backup. Another began organizing volunteers into search groups. A third started questioning the people closest to the swings. What exactly did you see? How long was she alone? Did anyone walk near her? Was anyone acting strange today? But answers were messy. People were emotional. Memory is fragile during panic. Some said they saw Ava on the swing. Some said they saw her walking away. Some weren't sure when they saw her at all. The timeline blurred almost instantly. Officers moved quickly, spreading across the playground and into the surrounding areas. Two walked toward the tree line, shining flashlights into pockets of shadow. Another officer jogged down a narrow dirt path that wrapped around the back of the park. Fourth searched the bathroom stalls, calling Ava's name as her voice echoed against the cold tile. Still nothing. More patrol cars arrived, then unmarked detective vehicles, then K-9 units. The perimeter expanded. The sense of urgency deepened. Search dogs sniffed the swing, the wood chips, the path leading to the trail. At first they seemed interested. They followed a scent toward the edge of the park. But just as quickly as they picked it up, they lost it. The dogs circled, confused, their handlers growing frustrated. It was as if the trail evaporated. As minutes turned into hours, dozens of volunteers became hundreds. People from neighboring streets, and eventually neighboring towns, arrived to help. They walked arm in arm through the fields, creating human chains that stretched across the grass. Others searched the woods in teams, calling Ava's name into the thickening dusk. Flashlights bobbed in the fading light. Shadows stretched across the park like long fingers. The air grew cooler, heavier, more ominous. By early evening, the sun had dipped low enough that the playground felt unfamiliar. What had been a bright, cheerful space earlier in the day was now cast in deep pockets of darkness. Each shadow felt threatening. Every rustle in the bushes made hearts skip. A lone police helicopter flew overhead, its spotlight cutting a harsh beam across the landscape. Neighbors stood on their porches, hands over their mouths, watching the search unfold. Some silently prayed. Others clutched their children tighter. And through it all, Ava's mother refused to leave the park. She stood near the swings, the last place her daughter had been seen, her hands gripping the metal chain so tightly her knuckles turned white. Tears streaked her cheeks. Her breathing came in sharp, shallow bursts. She kept staring at the swing, as if willing it to give her an answer, as if the empty seat held some clue she wasn't seeing, as if any second now Ava might come running back. But the swing only moved with the breeze, swaying gently, mocking the silence around it. Just before midnight, a chilling thought finally settled into the minds of investigators, something they hadn't wanted to admit until now. Ava didn't wander off. Ava wasn't hiding. Ava hadn't simply gotten lost. Someone had taken her, and the person who did it had been careful, precise, almost invisible. As one detective quietly whispered to another, "This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate." When morning broke over the small Colorado town, the search for Ava entered a new, more urgent phase. The soft golden light that spilled over rooftops felt cruelly out of place. Too beautiful, too peaceful for a day already heavy with dread. Most of the volunteers hadn't slept. Many of the officers hadn't either. People stayed up through the night, combing the grounds with flashlights and strained voices, hoping, praying that Ava would appear before sunrise. She didn't. The news spread quickly. By breakfast time, nearly everyone in town knew that a 6-year-old girl had vanished. Some learned from neighbors. Others heard whispers in grocery store aisles. Some turned on their radios or televisions to see headlines scrolling across the screen. Child missing from local playground. And by mid-morning, the playground had transformed into something unrecognizable. Yellow police tape fluttered in the breeze, cordoning off areas where children had been playing just hours earlier. Officers moved with stern expressions and clipped voices, directing volunteers, interviewing parents, marking the ground with orange flags. News vans lined the street, their antennas reaching up toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Reporters stood with serious faces, rehearsing lines before the camera switched on, but no one's face looked more hollow than Lillian's. She sat on the curb near the swings. Her hands clasped so tightly they shook. Her eyes were red and swollen, her hair still pulled back in the ponytail she'd made that morning, long before she knew her entire world would collapse. Officers had encouraged her to go home, to rest, to eat something, but she refused. She stayed rooted to the spot, convinced that if she left, she'd miss the moment Ava returned. Mark stood beside her, speaking quietly into his hand as detectives asked him questions he never imagined having to answer. He kept swallowing hard, his voice cracking whenever he said his daughter's name. Every parent imagines impossible scenarios for their children, but no one ever prepares for this one. How could they? Detectives knew that the first 24 hours were crucial, and the clock was already ticking fast. They began interviewing everyone who had been at the playground the previous day. They questioned teenagers, asking if they'd noticed anyone strange. They spoke to joggers, dog walkers, even people who had only passed by for a moment. Most had seen a bustling playground filled with families. No one had seen anything suspicious. No one had noticed a stranger grabbing a child. No one had heard a scream. It was the silence that confused detectives most. Children don't disappear quietly. Not like this. Not without some kind of struggle. Not without someone noticing. Unless the person who took her was incredibly fast. Or incredibly skilled. Or both. A detective with nearly 20 years on the force later admitted privately that the situation unnerved him more than he was willing to say out loud. There were no footprints leading away, no discarded items, no signs of distress. It was as if Ava had been erased from the playground. While officers continued interviewing witnesses, other teams began combing the neighborhood surrounding the park. They went door to door, knocking firmly, flashing badges, asking, "Did you see a little girl? Did you notice anything unusual? Did any cars pass by that seemed out of place?" Most people shook their heads, apologetic and frustrated that they couldn't be more helpful. A few mentioned a car or a person, but the details were vague, inconsistent, unreliable. A middle-aged man told officers he remembered seeing a blue sedan parked at the edge of the lot, but he couldn't recall the make, model, or even the driver. A teenage girl said she saw a white truck drive by slowly, but she didn't know if it was connected or if it was just someone looking for a parking space. A woman thought she might have noticed a man pacing near the tree line, but when pressed for details, she faltered. Everyone had seen something, but no one had seen the right thing, and in a case like this, where seconds mattered, the lack of clarity was devastating. Detectives moved back to the swings, examining the ground around them for the third time. They crouched, brushing away wood chips, searching for anything, a dropped hair tie, a footprint, a piece of fabric. But the playground was too chaotic. Too many people had walked through the area. Too many children had played there earlier. Any evidence that once existed had likely been trampled beyond recognition. Still, one detail troubled investigators deeply. The dogs had picked up a scent just after nightfall, the scent of a child leading toward the edge of the woods. But then the trail simply vanished. Not faded, not weakened. Vanished, as if Ava had been carried, as if her feet had left the ground. This discovery led detectives toward a chilling conclusion. Whoever took her might have lifted her quickly and efficiently. No dragging, no dropping, no signs of force, just hands, arms, speed, precision. Someone who knew what they were doing, someone who acted with purpose. The next step was to broaden the scope of the investigation. Officers began checking sex offender registries, looking for anyone living within a 10-mile radius who might have been near the playground. They looked into recently released offenders, drifters, and people who had been reported acting strangely in the past month. They studied recent 911 calls, reports of suspicious vehicles, complaints from neighbors about trespassers or unusual activity. Every file was scanned, every name examined, every possible connection considered. But the disturbing thing was this. Most cases like this have early clues: footprints, fibers, an eyewitness account, a scream in the distance. Something. Ava's case had nothing, and that absence told detectives something even more horrifying. If someone had taken Ava, it wasn't random, it wasn't messy, it wasn't impulsive, it was deliberate. A stranger passing through could have grabbed her in a chaotic moment, but someone experienced, someone who planned, could do it without being seen at all. By noon, one of the senior detectives stepped away from the cluster of officers and looked out at the playground. The swings moved slightly in the shifting breeze. The slide gleamed under the midday sun. Children's abandoned toys still lay in the grass. It should have been a place full of laughter. Instead, it was filled with dread. The detective exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples, then turned back to his team. "We need to consider the possibility," he said quietly, "that this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. Someone may have taken her, and they may have done it before." The idea hung in the air like smoke. No one wanted to believe it, but the evidence, or lack of evidence, was beginning to point in that direction. And if that was true, then the person who took Ava hadn't simply vanished. They were out there, somewhere, watching the investigation unfold, listening to the news, waiting for the world to move on. Because people like that, they count on time being on their side. As the investigation expanded, tips began flooding in from every direction, some hopeful, some confusing, and many heartbreaking in their uncertainty. The town had never experienced something like this before. When a child goes missing, fear spreads faster than any rumor, and within hours, everyone becomes hyper-aware of anything that feels remotely out of place. By the second day, the police hotline was ringing so constantly that additional operators had to be brought in from neighboring counties. People reported every strange car, every odd noise, every unfamiliar face they had seen in the past week. Some calls came from people who were certain they had spotted Ava in grocery stores, gas stations, rest stops, or even on the side of the road. But for every seemingly promising lead, investigators found themselves hitting walls. Walls built from confusion, misremembered details, and the frantic desperation of people who wanted to help but didn't really know what they saw. The first major tip that caught the attention of investigators came from a teenage boy who lived 2 blocks from the park. He said that shortly after Ava disappeared, he noticed a man walking quickly along the walking path that led away from the playground. The man had his hands shoved into the pockets of a dark jacket, and the boy claimed he looked nervous. Detectives brought the boy in for questioning and asked him to repeat his account several times. Each time the details shifted, slightly but noticeably. Sometimes the man was tall, sometimes average height. Sometimes he had facial hair, other times he didn't. It became clear the boy wasn't lying. He was simply uncertain. He had seen something odd, but whether it was connected to Ava or not was impossible to tell. Still, detectives followed the lead. They searched the path, interviewed people who lived nearby, checked for security cameras on residential homes, but nothing connected. Nothing confirmed the sighting. Nothing brought them closer to Ava. Then came the call from a convenience store clerk. She insisted she had seen a frightened little girl matching Ava's description enter the store with a man late the previous night. The clerk said the girl looked disoriented, like she was about to cry. Detectives raced to the store, but the security footage showed a girl who, yes, looked similar to Ava from a distance, but wasn't her. Another lead collapsed. Another piece of hope dissolved. Investigators tried not to let frustration show, but the weight of each false lead pressed heavier against them. Time was slipping, fast. In cases like this, the first 48 hours were often the difference between rescue and recovery. And as each hour passed with no breakthroughs, a grim reality crept in. Whoever took Ava had done it cleanly, quietly, and without leaving a trace. 3 days into the investigation, a pair of hikers stumbled upon something that sent an electric jolt through the command center. Deep in the woods, nearly a mile from the playground, they found a small scrap of pink fabric snagged on a low-hanging branch. They didn't touch it, they didn't move it. They took a photo and called the police immediately. Within minutes, detectives rushed to the site. The forest floor was covered in pine needles, dead leaves, and patches of dirt damp from early morning dew. The fabric was tiny, no larger than a coin, but its color, light pink, matched Ava's backpack. For the first time in days, there was a spark of hope. They carefully collected the fabric, sealed it, labeled it, and sent it to the lab with urgency in their steps. Everyone waited. Officers, parents, volunteers, journalists, even strangers across the state held their breath. But hours later, the results came back. The fabric didn't match, not the backpack, not the shirt, not the dress, not anything Ava owned. The disappointment was crushing. The hope, so briefly alive, vanished again. Meanwhile, rumors were beginning to spread throughout the community. Some people whispered about a mysterious figure who had been seen near the park in the days leading up to Ava's disappearance. A tall man wearing a baseball cap. Others described a woman who seemed out of place, sitting alone on a bench for hours. Stories circulated quickly, each one bending slightly as it passed from person to person. Detectives took every rumor seriously, even when the details were flimsy. They interviewed dozens of people, searching for threads that might lead somewhere. But each story unraveled under scrutiny. Then came the sighting that would become the most talked about lead in the entire case: the white pickup truck. Multiple witnesses, at least 6 of them, claimed they saw a white pickup truck circling the parking area near the playground before Ava disappeared. But the descriptions varied wildly. Some said the truck was old and rusty. Others said it was newer, with shiny chrome details. One witness insisted the driver was a man wearing sunglasses. Another was convinced the driver was a woman with blonde hair. Some thought the truck left quickly. Others thought it was moving slowly, almost creeping. Detectives considered this lead seriously. A vehicle would explain how someone could take a child and vanish so quickly. It fit the timeline. It fit the silence. It fit the almost impossible level of stealth required. But without a license plate, a consistent description, or a clear witness account, the lead was almost impossible to pursue. And that was the most unnerving element of all. Everything about this case felt like smoke. Every clue dissolved the second investigators reached out to grab it. It was as if the person who took Ava understood how investigations worked and had designed their actions to leave nothing behind. The volunteers kept searching. They moved through fields and forests, crawling under bushes, turning over fallen logs, wading through tall grass that brushed against their waists. They stayed out long after the sun set, flashlights flickering through the darkness, voices carrying into the night, but nothing. Not a shoe, not a ribbon, not a footprint that could be traced directly to Ava. Nothing. The dogs tried again and again, circling areas where her scent had once seemed strong, but it always ended the same way, abruptly, as if the scent had been lifted off the ground entirely. That detail haunted investigators. It suggested Ava had been carried, not walked, not dragged, carried, which meant whoever took her acted quickly, confidently, deliberately, someone who understood how to take a child without leaving a trail. By the end of the fourth day, detectives sat around a large table in a makeshift command center, maps sprawled out, notes scattered everywhere. Their faces were drawn, exhausted, pale. One of them spoke quietly, almost reluctantly. "It's like she disappeared into thin air." Another detective shook his head slowly. "No, someone took her. Someone who's done this before, or thought about it for a long time." Silence filled the room, heavy, suffocating, terrifying, because if that was true, then the investigation wasn't just about finding Ava anymore. It was about finding someone who planned, and may have been watching the playground long before that day. By the end of the first week, the energy surrounding the investigation had shifted. The frantic rush of the first 48 hours had faded into something heavier, slower, deeper, more quietly devastating. The crowds of volunteers who once combed the fields began to shrink. People still cared, deeply, but the exhaustion of long nights and long searches weighed heavily on the town. Even hope began to feel fragile. At the Merrick home, time seemed to stand still. Ava's parents barely slept. When they did, brief moments when their bodies finally gave out, it was only to wake moments later with pounding hearts, as if some part of them expected to hear their daughter calling from another room. But each time they opened their eyes, the house remained painfully unchanged. Her bed was still neatly made. Her stuffed rabbit still sat propped against the pillow. Her sneakers, small and worn, still lay by the bedroom door. Nothing in the house had been moved. Nothing had been touched. Nothing felt right. Her mother tried to keep busy in those early days, washing dishes that didn't need washing, folding clothes that were already folded, pacing through hallways with her arms wrapped around herself. She avoided Ava's room at first. Then one night, unable to bear the silence any longer, she stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was the smell. The faint scent of strawberry shampoo still clung to the air. Her daughter's drawings still decorated the walls. Crayon scribbles of family members holding hands, butterflies with uneven wings, hearts that dipped to the side. She traced her fingers over the edges of the pictures, her hands trembling as she whispered Ava's name. She didn't stay long. She couldn't. The weight of the emptiness was too much. Mark tried to be strong for the family, but grief found him in quieter moments, standing by the kitchen sink, staring blankly at his coffee, sitting in the car alone, trying to gather himself before going back inside. He carried guilt he didn't deserve, guilt that was nobody's fault. He kept replaying the morning of the disappearance in his mind. The pancakes, the laughter, the way Ava hugged him before she left. Had he held her long enough? Had he told her he loved her? He couldn't remember, and that uncertainty ate at him. But no one felt guilt more deeply than Jacob. He was only 8 years old, but he bore a burden far too heavy for a child. He kept replaying the moment, just seconds, when he looked away. The moment he turned his head. The moment he assumed she would still be there when he looked back. Everyone told him it wasn't his fault. Every officer said he didn't do anything wrong. Every adult assured him he had been a good brother. But logic doesn't soften the ache of guilt. And children don't process trauma the way adults do. They feel blame in a way that wraps tightly around their hearts. Jacob stopped sleeping in his own room. He kept waking up from nightmares where he heard Ava calling for him. He started sleeping on the couch, curled into a ball, flinching whenever the phone rang or when someone knocked on the door. Meanwhile, the detectives continued to work with a kind of grim determination. They revisited interviews, double-checked statements, and re-examined the timeline. When a case is this barren, this empty, Sometimes the only thing investigators can do is look again and again and again, hoping for something they missed. A detail, a phrase, a contradiction, anything. They returned to the playground multiple times, walking slowly across the open spaces, imagining the day of the disappearance. They watched the wind push the swings, studied the angles of the sight lines, traced possible paths a kidnapper could have taken. Some detectives stood silently near the wood. Chips, eyes narrowed, trying to picture the scene from the perspective of the person who took her. How did they move? Where did they stand? Where did they wait? What moment did they choose? The lack of answers haunted them, but one question haunted them most of all. Had the kidnapper been there before? People often imagine abductions as spontaneous acts, quick, chaotic, unplanned. But many cases aren't like that at all. Some predators watch, they observe patterns, they study routines until they find the one moment when everything lines up in their favor. A distracted parent, a crowded playground, a quiet child sitting alone on a swing. And when all the pieces align, they strike. The possibility that someone had been studying the playground, that someone had watched Ava not just on that day, but on days before, sent a chill through the investigative team. If that was true, this wasn't a random act. It was targeted, calculated, deliberate. By the second week, the case began to lose the momentum it once had. Not because anyone stopped caring, but because there were no new leads to pursue. The search radius widened, then widened again. Detectives traveled to nearby towns following tips that fizzled into nothing. They interviewed known offenders, scrap metal drivers, transient workers, anyone who could have been near the park. Every interview ended the same way: dead ends. The longer the investigation dragged on, the more the community changed. Parents no longer let their children walk alone. Schools added extra security volunteers. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, searching for signs of guilt in ordinary faces. Fear became part of daily life, subtle but constant, and through it all, a quiet, dreadful truth began to settle in. The person who took Ava had vanished, with the same silence they had used to take her. No fingerprints, no fibers, no witnesses, no trail. Just absence, just loss, just a hole no one could fill. One evening, after a long day of searching, a detective lingered near the empty swing set, staring at the chains as they rattled gently in the evening breeze. He whispered something no one else heard. Someone out there knows. Someone always knows. And that thought lingered, heavy and dark, because it meant the case wasn't just unsolved, it was unfinished. Somewhere the truth waited, maybe buried, maybe hidden, maybe held tightly by someone who had kept their secret for years. But it existed. It had to, because children don't just vanish. Someone made her disappear, and that someone wasn't done escaping yet. As weeks turned into months, and months slowly blurred into years, the disappearance of Ava Merrick became a wound that never fully healed. The once bustling playground gradually returned to normal life. Children laughing, swings creaking, parents chatting, but something intangible had shifted forever. The innocence that had once wrapped the neighborhood like a warm blanket was gone. A shadow remained, long and cold, stretching across every memory of that spring afternoon. Some residents said they never looked at the playground the same way again. Even years later, whenever the wind passed through the swings, making them sway without anyone sitting on them, people felt a pang in their chest, a reminder. A ghost of a moment that no one could forget. The Merrick family learned to survive, but they never truly healed. Healing requires closure, and closure requires answers. For years, Ava's mother kept her daughter's room exactly as it had been on the day she vanished. The bed remained neatly made. The stuffed rabbit stayed propped against the pillow, its fur worn thin. Drawings still covered the walls, stick figures holding hands, uneven hearts, butterflies with mismatched wings. The smell of strawberry shampoo faded slowly over time, but Lillian swore she could still sense it on some days, especially on quiet mornings when the sun shone through the window just right. She would sit on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the familiar patterns on the blanket, whispering to Ava as though she were still there, telling her about the day, telling her how much she was loved, telling her they hadn't stopped looking. Sometimes she cried until she couldn't breathe. Sometimes she sat in silence, tears drying on her cheeks. Sometimes she stayed there until the moon rose outside the window. Mark buried himself in work, Not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know how else to hold himself together. Grief gnawed at him quietly, like a constant dull ache in his chest. He tried to be strong for his family, tried to hold them together, but he carried guilt he could never shake. Guilt for letting his children go to the park. Guilt for not being there. Guilt, even though he knew, deep down, logically, it couldn't have been prevented. But logic never comforts a father who's lost his little girl. And Jacob grew up faster than any child should. The playful, wild boy who once raced his bike across the neighborhood became quieter, more withdrawn. He avoided the playground entirely. For years, he couldn't even walk near it. He blamed himself for looking away for those few seconds, the seconds that changed everything. People told him he wasn't responsible. Therapists told him he wasn't responsible. His parents told him he wasn't responsible. But guilt like his doesn't disappear. It transforms. It settles in the bones. It becomes part of the person carrying it. Detectives kept Ava's case open, even as the years stretched on. They reviewed the file every so often, flipping through pages that had become worn at the edges. They stared at her school photo, the one where she wore a blue dress and her smile was small but warm, and silently apologized for not finding her. Every now and then, a new tip would surface. A possible sighting in another state. Someone claiming they recognized her face. A rumor about a suspicious person who once lived near the playground. Each time, detectives would chase the lead, fueled by hope and duty, only to have it collapse under scrutiny. But they kept chasing, because cold cases don't die, they wait. Technology advanced. DNA analysis improved. Missing children's databases became more sophisticated. Investigators revisited the evidence, ran new tests, compared notes with experts in other states. They constructed age-progressed images of Ava, showing what she might look like at 10, 12, 15, 18. Each image was sent out to the public, hoping someone somewhere might recognize her. But no calls came in, no confirmations, no breakthroughs. Still, the case remained pinned to the board, literally. In the detective bureau, buried in a back hallway where cold cases lived, Ava's file hung on a corkboard beside dozens of others. But hers stood out. It wasn't just another case number, it was a question that haunted every officer who'd worked it. How does a child vanish from a crowded playground in broad daylight? The longer they sat with that question, the more disturbing the possibilities became. Maybe it was a stranger, someone passing through, someone who knew how to blend in, someone who recognized the opportunity and acted in seconds. Maybe it was someone from the neighborhood, someone familiar, someone who smiled at people during the day but carried a darkness no one saw. Or maybe, just maybe, the truth was even worse, something far more unexpected, something no one had even considered yet, because the most unsettling mysteries are the ones where the obvious explanation feels impossible, and the impossible explanation feels chillingly plausible. In time, the media moved on. New tragedies emerged. New stories took the headlines, but the Merrick family never moved on. They couldn't. Their lives became divided into two eras, before Ava and after Ava. Every birthday that passed felt like a wound. Every holiday carried a shadow. Every milestone that should have belonged to her. First day of middle school, first dance, first time driving a car, came and went like ghosts. Ava should have been there, but she wasn't, and not knowing why became the most painful part of all. Some mysteries fade because they're forgotten, some because they're solved. But Ava's lingered because it existed in a space between, unsatisfied, incomplete, unresolved. For the community, the case became a reminder that danger doesn't always look like danger. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't always come in the form of a stranger lurking in the shadows. Sometimes it appears in daylight, wearing a smile, blending in with the world. And in that moment, the moment when trust is assumed, a life can change forever. For those who still remember Ava, neighbors, teachers, officers, friends, her story is not just a tragedy. It's a warning, a wound, a question that still aches. Where is she? Because despite the silence, despite the years passing, despite the lack of answers, one truth remains undeniable. Someone out there knows what happened, and secrets, especially ones this heavy, don't stay buried forever. Someday, somewhere, somehow the truth might finally surface. Until then, Ava's story remains open, a thread waiting to be pulled, a voice waiting to be heard, a mystery waiting, patiently, painfully, for the moment when someone finally speaks. And when that moment comes, the world will finally know what really happened on that warm spring afternoon in 1994. As time moved on, the investigation into Ava's disappearance transformed into something far larger, far more complex than anyone in the town ever imagined. The early panic had slowly given way to quiet determination, but beneath that determination lived another emotion, something darker, something sharper. Suspicion. Not just suspicion toward strangers or transient workers or unfamiliar cars. Suspicion toward neighbors, friends, people the community had known for years. Because when investigators reviewed the case file again and again, a painful truth kept resurfacing. If no one saw a stranger take Ava, if no unknown vehicle sped out of the parking lot, if no outsider was lurking in the shadows, then what if the person responsible wasn't a stranger at all? This possibility created tension in a town that once prided itself on trust. People who had eaten dinners together, traded holiday cookies, borrowed lawn tools, and watched each other's kids began to look at one another differently. Who had been at the park that day? Who lived close enough to walk there? Who knew Ava well enough that she wouldn't be afraid to approach them? Detectives began re-examining everyone connected to the playground, not just passerby, but locals, residents, families, adults who had been close enough to take her and slip away unnoticed. They created a new list, not suspects, not officially, but persons of potential relevance. It included the man who owned the white truck seen near the park several times that month, a neighbor who had recently been fired and had no alibi for the time Ava vanished, a teenage boy known for loitering in the woods behind the park, a woman who lived alone and rarely interacted with others, but always seemed to be watching. None of these people had done anything wrong. None were accused. None were proven guilty. But the lack of evidence forced detectives to reconsider everything. They went back to the Merrick family and asked more questions, not because they suspected them, but because protocol demanded it. Every missing child case is investigated from the inside out. Did Ava know anyone outside of school? Had she mentioned someone new? Did she ever talk about someone at the playground? Was anyone showing her unusual attention? Mark and Lillian answered each question carefully, painfully, their voices raw from weeks of grief. They replayed every detail of Ava's life, searching their memories for anything they missed. But there was nothing unusual, nothing hidden, nothing that suggested danger. Meanwhile, detectives started scrutinizing Ava's daily routine, her walking routes, her classroom seating chart, her friendships, her after-school activities. They searched for patterns. They searched for opportunities. They searched for someone who might have noticed the quiet girl who always sat on the swing while her brother ran off to play. And then, something unexpected happened. A teacher from Ava's kindergarten class contacted investigators with something she hadn't mentioned earlier, not because she hid it intentionally, but because she hadn't realized it might matter. She said Ava had recently mentioned a friend she made at the playground, not a child, an adult. The teacher didn't think much of it at the time. Kids were imaginative. Kids said things. But when investigators asked Ava's parents, they were stunned. Ava had never mentioned an adult friend. She barely talked to strangers at all. Detectives pressed for details. What did she say exactly? Did she describe them? Did she mention a name? The teacher tried to remember, closing her eyes to piece together the conversation. She said someone talked to her while she was on the swing one day. Someone older, someone nice. That word, nice, echoed through the minds of investigators. Nice, friendly, familiar, someone who didn't scare her, someone who made her feel safe. But Ava didn't describe the person. Not their face, not their clothes, not their voice, just that they were nice. This revelation shook the investigation, because if Ava had interacted with an adult before, if someone had spoken to her, built trust, watched her, then the disappearance might not have been random at all. Detectives began cross-referencing the new information with the list of people who were at the park regularly. Parents, babysitters, volunteers, joggers, dog walkers, anyone who had consistent access to the playground. They discovered that one man, a local handyman, visited the park frequently while doing landscaping jobs for nearby homes. He often took breaks near the benches. He smoked near the swings. He chatted casually with children and parents. When detectives questioned him, he was polite, cooperative, even helpful. But something felt off. His timeline didn't match perfectly. His memory seemed too polished, too rehearsed. He insisted he had nothing to do with Ava's disappearance, and maybe he didn't, but some detectives couldn't shake the uneasy feeling his presence left behind. Another name surfaced, a volunteer from a nearby children's center. He had been seen at the park occasionally, though no one remembered him being there that day. He denied everything. Still, investigators dug into his background, searching for any connection that would tie him to Ava. Nothing concrete appeared, but threads of possibility lingered. The deeper detectives dug into the town, the more they realized something unsettling. A kidnapper doesn't need to be a stranger. A kidnapper can be someone unnoticed, someone unremarkable, someone who blends into the background so seamlessly that no one thinks to question them. And that was exactly the kind of person investigators feared most. Someone who had time, someone who had patience, someone who watched, someone who waited, because if Ava really did know the person who took her, if she trusted them enough to approach them, then the abduction wouldn't have required force. It would have required familiarity, kindness, soft words, a moment of opportunity, just one moment, one heartbeat, one glance away, one window of time small enough to miss, but large enough to change everything. And for the first time, detectives began to whisper a new phrase among themselves, quietly, reluctantly, but with a growing sense of dread. What if the kidnapper lived here? As the years passed, the investigation into Ava Merrick's disappearance shifted from an active manhunt into something quieter, colder, but no less important. Her case moved into a special category, one reserved for mysteries that refused to fade, even when time tried to bury them. Detectives rotated in and out of the department, new officers joining, older ones retiring, but Ava's file never left the cold case locker. It sat there, thick and worn, waiting for the day when someone finally opened it again and found something everyone else had missed. Every so often, a new detective would be assigned to review the case. They would sit down at a desk late at night with the file spread wide open, the fluorescent light above humming softly, casting a pale glow across pages aged by grief. They would study timelines, statements, maps, theories long since abandoned, and for a moment, Ava would feel alive again in the room, like her story was reaching out, asking once more to be understood. Some detectives cried during those reviews. Others grew angry. Most just felt helpless. Because how do you solve a case where nothing makes sense? Where no witness sees anything? Where no evidence remains? How do you chase a ghost? Still, they tried. They ran new DNA tests on old evidence, hoping that modern technology would reveal something missed in the early years. They compared Ava's case to similar abductions across the country, searching for patterns, methods, signatures, behaviors. They studied profiles of child predators who operated with stealth, those who selected quiet children, those who blended into communities. Some cases looked eerily similar. Some suspects seemed possible, but none of them matched perfectly. Not one. The town changed too. New families moved in. Old ones moved away. Children who once played beside Ava grew up, left for college, started their own lives. Some of them still thought about her when they visited home, pausing at the playground, remembering that afternoon that never left them. For a long time, the swing where Ava had sat was left untouched. No one wanted to use it. It became a silent memorial, an empty seat that swayed in the wind long after the laughter had stopped. Eventually, the city replaced the playground equipment with a newer, safer design. But even then, the space held a heaviness. Parents watched their children more closely. Conversations quieted when shadows stretched across the grass in the late afternoon. The Merrick family tried to live again, each in their own way. Mark grew older, shoulders heavier with each passing year. He still checked the mailbox each morning, even when he didn't know what he was hoping to find. A letter, a clue, something, anything. Lillian kept Ava's room exactly the same. Decades passed before she allowed herself to enter without trembling. Dusk gathered gently on the windowsill. Sunlight filtered through the faded curtains. The drawings on the wall, bright and crooked, never changed, though everything else in the house did. She talked to Ava sometimes, out loud, in the quiet moments when grief felt too heavy to swallow. Jacob grew into adulthood, haunted by the memory of his sister. He carried her absence into every chapter of his life. The guilt that wasn't his to carry stayed with him anyway. Even as a grown man, he still found himself scanning playgrounds when he drove past them, looking for something, anything. that might offer closure he had been denied since childhood. But the world kept turning. People aged, buildings changed, and Ava remained 6 years old forever. Occasionally, a new tip appeared, someone who thought they had seen her, someone who claimed to know something, but each hope faded as quickly as it came. The case stretched into decades, and the silence surrounding that afternoon only grew louder. Detectives eventually reached a conclusion, though it wasn't one they ever announced publicly. Someone had taken Ava, someone who planned, someone who knew how to move unnoticed, someone who disappeared just as quickly as they came. And the most chilling part of all? Someone who likely lived among them, if only for a moment. The truth about what happened to Ava Merrick may never be known. It may be sitting inside the mind of a person who has carried the secret for years. It may be buried deep in a memory someone refuses to revisit. It may be hidden in a clue no one has recognized yet. But there is one undeniable truth. Mysteries like this do not vanish. They linger, they wait, they haunt. Ava's story remains unfinished, not because her life was short, but because her disappearance left a void that nothing could ever fill. She is the question that echoes through time, the shadow that stretches across every investigation, the reminder that safety is fragile and innocence can disappear in an instant. Somewhere out there, the answer exists. A person knows, a truth waits, and until that truth is found, the name Ava Merrick will continue to live on, not as a statistic, not as a case number, but as a child who should have grown up, laughed, loved, lived, and never vanished from a crowded playground in broad daylight. Her case remains open, her memory remains alive, and her story remains one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries the world has ever known.